Hello, everybody. I am Marc LiVecche, Executive Editor of Providence, and I am the Stockdale Research Fellow at the Stockdale Center for Ethical Leadership at the U.S. Naval Academy. And I am thrilled to be speaking today to the historian Richard Frank. We are going to begin our discussion of his latest book, Tower of Skulls. Richard is also the author of a book called Downfall, which I think is the premier history of the conclusion of the war. And I would like to take us today from a discussion of Tower of Skulls, particularly to how it sets the context for the end of the war. So, Richard, thank you very much for being with us today.
Well, thank you very much for having me.
It's great to speak with you. You list in the introduction to Tower of Skulls that what you are doing is a reappraisal in some ways of World War II, from the first shots fired in July of 1937 to the fall of Corregidor in May of 1942. Now, I should say that this is a trilogy. You've produced the first volume. The first volume has to end someplace, but one senses that the decision to end where volume one does is not arbitrary. So what does that period of time signify?
Well, it's basically the story of China alone, China enduring, China contributing in ways that we've neglected for a very long time. The specific decision about where to end this first volume was very deliberate. The surrender of Corregidor occurs on the 6th of May, 1942. By that evening, Japan's empire arguably is at absolute zenith. The very next day, 7 May 42, is the first day of the main action of the Battle of Coral Sea. And this is basically like the Japanese are up here, and now the descent, which at the first the glide path is pretty shallow, is going to start. And the second volume goes to August of 44 into Mariana's campaign. The third volume will pick up in September of 44, but will not end in September 45 with a formal surrender. It's designed, the whole arc of this trilogy also is intended to talk about how what happened from 37 to 45 shaped the world we live in right down to today. The most conspicuous aspect about that is that quite arguably there would be no People's Republic of China without Japan's war in China in 1937 to 45. And my authority for that is no less than Mao Zedong, who said that repeatedly, including to a Japanese prime minister in 1972. That basically, if you guys have not run that war against China, the nationalists, I probably never would have triumphed.
Wow. So when we say reappraisal, we mean very much a corrective. You note early on that very often the popular conception of the war in the Pacific is a war that was fought between Japan and America. And for many of us, even more specifically, well, it was a war that was fought between Japan and U.S. Marines. We don't even know the full context. So if a reappraisal is a corrective, what are some of the misconceptions of the war in the Pacific that you're particularly interested in setting right? What's the better historical story that you're telling?
Yeah, well, really, what I'm essentially doing, by calling it the Asia-Pacific War, what I'm attempting to do is create a narrative that writes back in this titanic struggle that's primarily on the Asian continent. What I call this the Arc of Asia. In 1937, it ran from India, which at that time included Pakistan and Bangladesh, east across China to Japan and the Western Pacific, and southeast to what's now Indonesia. And in that swath of the globe at that time, there were over 1 billion people. And the total population of the world in 37 was estimated usually to be about 2.3 billion. So you're literally talking about half the population of the world. And that whole swath of the Arc of Asia, I call it, was overwhelmingly people living in some sort of form of colonialism. There were only 4 nation states that had some claim of sovereignty. What was Siam in 37 shortly became Thailand, and Japan had actual sovereignty. You had Mongolia, which was a Soviet client state, had no real sovereignty. You had China, which had very fractured sovereignty. And the Philippines is a very special case. They were an American colony, but they'd been promised independence in 1934 in about a decade. And so they had that to look forward, which would have a very powerful effect upon how the Filipinos reacted to the war. And ultimately, when Japan's empire is at zenith, as best I can calculate, including about 260 some million Chinese, the Japanese had within a dominion about 516 million people. By contrast, at the max, Hitler's Germany had control of maybe 366 million people. So the scale of this is not only important, it's
Right.
gigantic. And the
Right.
notion we've entirely lost sight of this whole dimension of the Second World War, to me is just amazing.
That's right. So what you're painting very clearly is a story that involves China in extraordinary ways. What is the Chinese story that needs to be told?
Well, there's several stories. I think the main thing to bear in mind is that 1937, I call China the fractured state. And the Japanese had occupied Manchuria and they come to dominate some of the provinces down towards the Great Wall. The rest of China was not already in sort of the standard narrative we've been given now for some time. This notion that in 37 you already have this either active or incipient civil war between the nationalists and the
Right.
communists. And in fact, in 1937, the nationalists are by far the biggest faction in China. They have 7 provinces and about 170 million people, which is over a third of the 450 million people in China. The Chinese communists are at extraordinarily low level at that point. This is after the Great Leap, and Mao is now up in somewhere in the northwest part of China, that's even poor by Chinese standards.
Mm.
And he actually controls at that point about 1.45 million people, which is not 3% of the population of China, it's 0.3%. I mean, that's one
Wow.
of the other long-term arcs of this, is that it's extraordinary how the war is going to affect and how Mao is going to exploit the war to develop this enormous power base for the Chinese Communists, the Red Army, by 1945. So China's in a very, very low state at that point. At the same time, uh, the Chinese nationalists have sort of reached this sort of tipping point after more than a century of humiliation that finally, and it's by no means uniform. You got large swaths of China in the hinterland where nobody cares what's going on
Mm.
internationally. But in the areas of China along the seaboard and more sophisticated areas of China, there's this growing consciousness of nationalism and they need to restore their sovereignty. And that's very much what Chiang Kai-shek is devoted to doing.
As a reappraisal, as a corrective, were there things in your own studies as you're digging into the new material? And you had discussed earlier with me that a part of why your volume comes at a good time is we simply now have access to more information than previous historians had. As you began wading into this new material, was there anything that surprised you? Your book is constantly surprising me. Was there anything in your research that threw you off?
Well, there were quite a number of things, but one of the most conspicuous, I think, is Joseph W. Stilwell, who became the American proconsul in China. And I was, and the arc of China's reputation, particularly the nationalist China reputation, went from a very high point in 37 to about 43, and then began a decline and then sort of fell off the curve after 49 or whatever here. And Stilwell, of course, famously was highly critical of Chiang Kai-shek and the nationalists. So I was thoroughly marinated in that version of history, starting from journalistic accounts, the Army official history series, and I think the epitome was Barbara Tuchman's Stilwell and the American Experience in China. Now I see, after we got this other information, the basic problem was the basis for the histories that were written in that fashion were the information that Stilwell and his acolytes had created. And once you get Chinese material uh, and particularly once in 2007, when Chiang Kai-shek's diaries were published, even historians in the People's Republic of China were saying it just changed everything, because now all these mythologies about what he thought, or he didn't want to fight the Japanese when he did.
Mhm.
He just realized it was going to be a titanic endeavor, whatever here. And Stilwell basically he had no real, I mean, he had a little brush as a platoon leader in China in the 1920s or 30s. He had no experience, and he's trying to lead Chinese armies, and the Chinese generals have been fighting the Japanese for 4 or 5
Right.
years. And
Right.
you wonder when he issues this operational concept in Burma, which is it just totally screwed up. And so far from the Chinese being unwilling to follow him, they're saying, this is stupid. We're not going to follow this or whatever here. So that was probably the single most startling thing. And also the other thing is to realize that he's basically almost exactly paired with British General William Slim, who
Right.
now everyone recognizes as one of the very greatest generals of World War II. Some would argue, I would agree, he was really the best British general of World War II,
Mm.
more so than Montgomery when you consider what he did with what he had and where he was. So that's probably the singular surprise I would point out.
Well, you've talked about your own military experience and a recognition of the fog of war, and that in the heat of battle, it's hard to have a good understanding of the information at hand. But you do draw this remarkable dichotomy between Stillwell and Slim. Whereas even Slim, you have this anecdote where Slim goes to a Chinese general and asks, well, if one way to learn to fight the Japanese is to find somebody who's beaten them in battle, how about we go talk to the locals, to the people who know? That's an
Right.
extraordinary story.
Yeah. Well, and it's when I read that and I was thinking, this is so it's so insightful. I mean, Slim has the hubris, the common sense to say, okay, I've never dealt with the Japanese before. Who should I talk to? Well,
Right.
somebody who beat him, you know.
Right.
And Stillwell comes in with the notion that I'm the font of all wisdom, and just listen to me, and we will be triumphant or whatever. Here, it's when you get that picture, then you realize the limitations. Now there are a lot of things about Stillwell that are, from an American standpoint, you sort of this blunt, bluff, no pretense guy that always appeals to Americans or whatever here. But there's other dimensions to leadership than that.
Now, I don't mean this to turn into a beating up on Stillwell session, but one rarely reads a history that leaves you thinking one personality in one location in one moment in time has had a tremendous influence on the future. I'm sure some of that is too strongly said, but Stillwell's decisions seem, to have a profound effect on the future of China. Is that fair?
It did in important ways, and also the other thing is that basically the whole framework for the narrative about China from 1942 onward was crafted through the lens of though you're looking through the eyes of Stillwell, and the inability to recognize that there are definite problems with Stillwell's view and understanding or whatever here. And there's a really, I'll get to this in the second volume. There's Shang, after the Burma disaster, is thinking about asking for Stillwell's recall, and Madam Shang talks him out of it. And that may be one of the greatest disastrous decisions that Shang made in his whole reign or whatever here. It's also an interesting commentary that Madame Chiang Kai-shek was the most powerful woman in World War II in terms of someone who actually directly influenced decision making at the highest levels. There's no other woman who was in a comparable position, and this is in China, which is not exactly a gender neutral country at that time or whatever here. So the sea of ironies you can get into in something on this size of a canvas is just amazing.
That's striking. If one more question on this trajectory, if I were a newly commissioned lieutenant and I came to you and I said, sir, what could Stillwell teach me about military leadership? What would be the things you might say, to the positive or to the negative? What are the lessons that Stillwell has to say about
the thing I would say is read William Slim's memoir, Defeat
right?
Under Victory. It's one of the all-time great senior officer memoirs. It's insightful. It's honest. It's just an extraordinary piece of work, and historians certainly have recognized this for a very long time. That Slim's memoir, not only Slim's performance, but Slim's memoir, is so incredibly insightful. I would elevate that above any other senior officer, certainly on the Allied side during World War II. If you want to get leadership lessons, go to Slim.
Go to Slim. Very good. You and I first spoke because as some of the listeners know, I'm writing a book defending the dropping of the bomb on Hiroshima, and obviously I was attracted to Downfall because it helps set the context for the end of the war. But in interviews that you've done about Tower of Skulls, you've used this phrase that I have found striking. where you said you wanted to count all the bodies. Where does that phrase come from? What do you mean?
Okay, well, basically, I was actually had this in mind when I did Downfall, although I didn't articulate it directly. I mean, one of the things I do in Downfall that sets, I think, that work apart from a lot of the others, particularly the area I call uh, most Americans living today have no idea that for about 20 years after the war, there was no great controversy about the use of the bombs in the
Right.
U.S.
Right.
It only began from about the mid 60s. And the literature, the history that was produced at that time came under this pejorative adjective of revisionism or revisionist. And I don't agree with that at all, because any historian has new evidence, new interpretation, revisions. I just call it the critical literature. So that I need to make that term clear now, rather than why I don't use the term revisionism or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
But basically, what I thought then and what I did then was I believe that two fundamental principles to understand and above all to judge these events are to first count all the dead, and secondly, and just as important, to treat all the dead as sharing a common humanity. So when I did Downfall, I open it, the opening chapter is this searing, stomach-churning account of tens of thousands of Japanese dying in this incendiary attack in Tokyo, March 45. In the chapter on Hiroshima, I provide an extended discussion of exactly what sort of hell that was on the ground,
Right.
both immediately and on the latent deaths. In fact, so much so that one of the volumes in the critical literature called Hiroshima's Shadow, when it came time to describe graphically what happened in Hiroshima, they didn't go to one of their colleagues. They used my work to describe it. So I wanted to make it very clear that when I talk about counting all the dead and treating all its sharing, I very much mean the Japanese. But what I was also got into in Downfall was this enormous death toll that Japan caused in the Asia Pacific War. And at the point I wrote Downfall, we still didn't have all the data or whatever. But what it boils down to is this: I mean, we think, using pretty conservative numbers, that the Asia Pacific War resulted in the deaths of about 19 million human beings. And of that 19 million, maybe pushing towards the high end, a million to 1.2 million were Japanese.
Mm-hmm.
Which immediately tells you that for every Japanese non-combatant who died, there were 17 or almost 18 other non-combatants. They were overwhelmingly other Asians, about 12 million of them were Chinese. And for the Chinese, if you take the 12 million non-combatant deaths over 8 years, about 3,000 days, almost exactly. I mean, that's 4,000 dead Chinese every single day for 8 years that the war went on. Simple demographics tells you that about a quarter of them, or more than a quarter of them, were children under 14. So that's 1,000 dead Chinese kids every day. The other parts of it, almost 6 million. This is after December 41, and that also works out mathematically to just about, well, actually over 4,000 a day. So that's 8,000 deaths per day of non-combatants who are not Japanese. About 2,000 of them are children under 14. And while I want to make it very clear that I'm going to count the Japanese, all the Japanese dead, I'm not going to neglect and ignore. And what's very unfortunate in my view about a lot of this literature is that although they're very graphic, they count the dead Japanese, they provide very graphic descriptions of and humanize what this really means in terms of individuals and people. But when you turn to all the other dead, the non-Japanese non-combatants, you seldom get numbers or even references, and you never get the sort of searing depiction of what this means. I mean, look in all this literature for one graphic description of one dead Chinese child. Look everywhere. You won't find it.
Right. That's right. And context matters. And when we have breezy discussions about not rushing to end the war with the bomb, every day that ticks by can be counted 8,500 times in lost souls. And that somehow that ought to matter in our deliberations.
Right. And let me emphasize that the American leadership at that time, we sort of talked about this before.
Right.
You have to remember that they didn't know specific numbers, but they sure as heck were enormously aware of the fact that enormous numbers of people were dying every single day the war went on. And one of the things one of my colleagues, Thomas Doherty of Brandeis, pointed out to me that I thought was quite telling was he went through all the newsreels Americans were watching. And the average American was going to the movies twice a week in the 30s and 40s. Every standard program had a newsreel with it, whatever here. And as Tom pointed out, when he went through all these things, what he was struck by was that the amount of really visceral graphic imagery of atrocity that the average American was seeing was much fuller and richer and stomach churning from Asia, and particularly Japan and China, than anything they were seeing about Nazi Germany, all the way through Pearl Harbor. So Americans, and in fact, one of the things I talk about in Tower of Skulls is it's not like suddenly the Japanese attack Pearl Harbor and the American people become very angry. They
Right.
were already in a very high state of anger about what they were seeing, about what had been going on in China, particularly in China, well before Pearl Harbor.
That's right. That's right. And yeah, in your book drives that home. You have images of Japanese bombardments, uh, graphic images of the people just littering the steps, um, in one of your photos, and that drives that story home. There's a difference in being defeated and knowing you've been defeated and surrendering. And toward the end of
Yes.
the war, that distinction seems to be operative. When did the Japanese know they were defeated, and why didn't they surrender?
It's an interesting point. A very distinguished historian, Edward Drey, pointed out that at the time of the fall of Mariana Islands in between July and August of 1944, the War Diary of the Operations Section of the Imperial Army, this quote secret war diary, it bluntly says we've lost the war, in terms of my military measure. But defeat and surrender are two entirely different things. Just like in the Civil War, the Confederacy effectively was defeated by June, July of 1863, and they don't surrender until April of 1865. Germany is almost the same thing.
Right.
Mid 1943, and they don't surrender until literally we put boots all over Germany
Right.
in April, May 1945. So there's a talking about saying, well, the Japanese were defeated. That doesn't mean they're going to surrender. And from the Japanese standpoint, this is sort of curious thing. The more nationalist, sort of right wing part of the Japanese political spectrum, I was told although there were things about my book Downfall they didn't like, one thing they did warm their hearts was I pointed out, look, the strategy the Japanese adapted in January 1945. They recognized that if they couldn't change the military balance, they were not going to be able to obtain an end of the war that they would find satisfactory. And they believed the only way they could do that was to either defeat or inflict such huge casualties on the initial American invasion that the American will to pursue the war to unconditional surrender would be broken.
Mm-hmm.
And they correctly estimated that we were coming to southern Kyushu, and they made this huge buildup in southern Kyushu. And then from the American side, when the radio intelligence started spilling out these identifications of Japanese units, particularly in the last 2 weeks of July and the first days of August 45. And suddenly, instead of going in with this overpowering superiority, it now looks like we're going in, basically just a guaranteed bloodbath,
Right.
And so, as I said, some of the Japanese were thinking, well, see, our guys were not so dumb after all. They had actually worked out a strategy that the Americans recoiled when they realized that this is what invading Japan might entail. I've gone further. I think, to me, it's very difficult to imagine anyone who conceivably would have been president by late July, August of 45. You could put all of them on the spectrum. Looking at what Mr. Truman was looking at, would not have chosen to take the next measure he could or whatever, and hope that it ended. I mean, in some ways, what we're doing in 1945 is doing everything we've already been doing. Blockade, bombard, we're going to invade, and we're going to add atomic bombs and hope that in some point along this path, it'll finally be enough for the Japanese leadership. And one final point on this. One thing that is not noted in the literature, which should be highlighted, in my view, is this. As the Joint Chiefs of Staff noted in April 45, we were seeking unconditional surrender. But the two big problems they found with that was, first of all, no Japanese government had ever surrendered in the history of Japan. Now, but Japanese count, that's 2,600 years, going back into history and mytho history, whatever. And the second thing was no Japanese unit had ever surrendered any skirmish, battle, or campaign of the war. So if you're looking forward, as American leaders were towards the end of the war, there was no clear end in sight. There was no guarantee that we would get what I call this organized capitulation of Japan's government and our forces, and the prospect about what would be entailed to eventually defeat up to 5 million Japanese under arms in Japan, the Asian continent, and the Pacific, which is what Mr. Stimson talks about when he uses the famous million number. That's really what that's about.
Right.
You know, if you're looking at that, and you wonder why Mr. Truman was feeling enormous pressure to bring the war to successful conclusion and not do that by incredible levels of blood, both American and Japanese.
That's right. And not forgetting your earlier point that the Kyushu invasion was going to take place November 1st. We drop a bomb early August. That's 3 months of a continuing ticking away of lost lives in occupied lands.
Right. And there's more, as I talk about in Downfall. There are other dimensions to this. It turns out the Japanese rice crop collapses in 45, and this is going to put the Japanese urban population in a extremely dire situation that first year after the surrender. And that's a whole separate story. But one of the things I'd like to emphasize, and people who don't know this part of the story, is that, we get to Japan, the Japanese leadership that we're dealing with says we're facing famine in 46. At first, we're skeptical about that. The Japanese don't have a high level of credibility with us at that point. But by the end of 45, the occupation authorities, up to and including MacArthur, recognized that the Japanese are correct. You can do the numbers on the food intake, and by the summer of 46, the Japanese are going to be in a very dire situation. The only way to save them is to send American food, and eventually, with MacArthur spearheading it, one of the most noble things he ever did, and Mr. Truman approving it, we're feeding 18 million Japanese urban dwellers in July, 20 million in August, and 15 million in September. That's between 1 in 4 and 1 in 5 of the Japanese population. And we estimate that saves 11 million Japanese lives, which makes, think about that compared to atomic bombs or whatever here. It's an incredible story.
That's right. No, that's fantastic. It's an incredible story. It's a story you tell incredibly well in both Downfall and in the Tower of Skulls. I commend both volumes to our listeners. I'm looking forward to parts 2 and 3. Richard Frank, thank you very much for your time.
Well, thank you very much for having me. And good luck with your work too.
Thank you.